Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the City Club of Chicago.
Smart people may disagree about what makes a great city, but part of what makes Chicago great is that we don't have to agree. To run a city like ours, a lot of issues come up. The City Club of Chicago is a place to debate those issues and hear from the men and women who shape the policies, lead the industries, and tell the stories that define our city. For the free and open exchange of ideas, the City Club of Chicago.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. On this Tuesday, February 19th, in 1 week, voters will decide among an unprecedented 14 candidates for mayor. Hear from 5 of them in our third and final mayoral candidate forum. That's next on Chicago Tonight. Thank you for joining us. I'm Carol Marine. It's been a mayoral election unlike any other, as a huge field of candidates competes to replace outgoing Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. Next Tuesday's election will determine which 2 candidates make it to a presumed April 2nd runoff. Last Thursday and last night, we heard from 9 of those candidates. Tonight, it's the remaining 5 in conversation about city finances, education, ethics, and violence. And a note before we begin, this isn't a traditional debate. There will be no opening or closing remarks. Each candidate will not necessarily get the same questions. And while answers are not being timed, I may interrupt if I must in an effort to cover as much ground as we can. Joining us in the order they appear on the ballot are Gary McCarthy, former Chicago Police Superintendent. He also served as head of the Newark Police Department and as a deputy commissioner in New York City. Gary Chico, an attorney who has served as chief of staff to Mayor Richard M. Daley, president of the Chicago Public Schools, and president of the Chicago Park District Board, as well as the Illinois State Board of Education. Amara Enya, a public policy consultant and founder of the Institute of Cooperative Economics and Economic Innovation. She previously ran for mayor in 2015. LaShawn Ford, who has served since 2007 as state representative from Illinois' 8th District, which covers much of Chicago's West Side. He is also a real estate investor. And Lori Lightfoot, a former senior partner with the firm of Mayor Brown, head of the Chicago Police Board and the Police Accountability Task Force, as well as a former assistant U.S. attorney. We are also joined this evening by members of the City Club of Chicago and their guests. Our thanks to the City Club for helping us underwrite this forum. And we welcome to our radio listeners on WBEZ 91.5 FM and to everyone watching our live stream on Facebook, on YouTube, and on our website. You can join the conversation on Twitter at WTTW using the hashtag #ChicagoTonight. Our thanks again to the City Club. We are so glad that you are here and helping us with this. And as we begin, let's begin with you, Gary Chico. In a significant development today, a federal judge this afternoon allowed a lawsuit against the Obama Presidential Center to proceed. Mr. Chico is a former president of the Park District. Do you support the current Jackson Park site?
I do. I think that it is very unique in our history, both Chicago and Illinois, to have a former president from our city, and the fact that he chose Chicago to come back and build his library and campus is something that we ought to embrace, not only for us today, but for future generations of Chicagoans. It's a wonderful asset for our city.
And yet the plaintiffs in this lawsuit feel that since it is not technically a library and is a center, that they argue it's been a parkland land grab. Lori Lightfoot, your view on that?
Well, look, I was a person who favored a different location, particularly Washington Park, because I think that area would have profited greatly from what I hope is a significant infusion of economic development. I've been following closely the developments of the case, and I was aware of the judge's ruling. And the central question, I think, was whether or not the plaintiffs had standing to even bring the case. Look, but I think fundamentally what has to happen, as mayor, I would not have let this situation fester. I would have gone on the front end and negotiated a site that I think people could have been happy with. And most importantly, what I think is still undone is for those people that are in Jackson Park, where we already see real estate speculation driving up the cost of real estate. Development doesn't have to mean displacement, but it means that we have to be intentional about the way in which we are trying to help people in those communities.
LaShawn Ford, your view on this?
I think that the process should play out, and I think that what we need more is when people have access to government and they're able to express themselves. So I support the library where it's at, but I also support the democracy that's taking place in this.
Do you agree, Amara Inya?
Well, we should learn from what happened with the proposed Lucas Museum just a few years ago that was also challenged because of the location on prime lakefront property. I think as these kinds of development opportunities come, we have to be very thoughtful in terms of location, and we also have to make sure that we're engaging all of the necessary stakeholders in the process. I would be concerned with how the process plays out, but it has to, but also making sure that conversations around a community benefits agreement are front and center so that those community voices can be brought in at the front end of the project and not be stalled during the process.
You're nodding, Gary McCarthy?
Yeah, I'm agreeing. This is an example of top-down government, which is what we seem to do here always in Chicago, telling people what we're going to do instead of asking the community what they think before we take a step like this. And that's got to change. We have to have the community input into everything.
Gary McCarthy, the Sun-Times reports that Mayor Emanuel has signed the heads of the Park District, the city colleges, the Housing Authority, and public schools to golden parachute contracts, meaning they get to keep their jobs after he leaves, or presumably the taxpayers have to buy them out. Is that ethical?
He didn't include me in that, right?
Correct.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. This is typical. No, it's not ethical. It's not ethical at all. And it's typical of what we do here. We know the financial straits that we're in, and what's happening is the next mayor, whoever it may be, is getting their hands tied by a series of events that are happening, whether it's a new police academy, whether it's the library, or whether it's a consent decree, all at the same time, and that's not okay.
And Gary Chico, do you think it's okay?
No, I don't. I think that the next mayor ought to have the privilege of picking their team, both in terms of a cabinet and other agency heads. Why? Those people need to be accountable to the mayor and that vision. I don't think this is right to tie the hands of the future mayor with people that were from the previous administration. I think this could have been done in a more thoughtful way that had the terms of those appointees expiring upon the end of the term of the mayor.
The TIF district for the Lincoln Yards project just moved a key step closer to approval today. The project has taken really heavy fire, but I guess my question to you is, what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is first to go back to the basics of TIF. A lot of critics of the project are wondering why we're using almost $1 billion of public funds to fund a project that might already have funds to begin with. TIFs were designed to be used to spur economic development in blighted communities, and this project is not that. Also, the way in which this project has moved forward, it's been horrendously rushed forward.
But it's too late, right? I mean, is it functionally too late?
It's certainly not too late. It is certainly not too late. We've seen a lot of resistance and a lot of excellent points about why this is not something that we should be contemplating almost $1 billion of public funds, especially when we do not have balanced development and projects that are happening elsewhere in the city that could be using public funds. So it's certainly not too late. We have to slow down the process, and I don't think that this mayor should be rushing it forward before his term is out.
Chicago is soon going to need to contribute $1 billion more to its pension funds. LaShawn Ford, where is that money going to come from?
Well, there's only two ways that we can deal with our pension crisis. We have to deal with it in Springfield and or raise revenue. And so Chicago has to do everything that it can to stop the waste, fraud, and abuse that we see.
We hear that all the time, LaShawn.
Carol, it's true. I mean, if we don't stop bleeding in this city and stop the police misconduct lawsuits, if we don't stop the high rises from not paying their taxes downtown, we're never going to get this under control. So right now we have people downtown that's not paying their fair share, And so we can never raise enough revenue to fix this problem if we don't make sure that people pay their fair share in this city.
If we add that all together, Lori Lightfoot, are we going to get the $1 billion that we need to shore up the pension fund?
No, but we have to build the case for revenue. We can't just keep treating taxpayers like they're an ATM machine with no limit. And the point that LaShawn was making, I think, is valid. We have a lot of out-of-control expenses in the city government. And you've heard me talk before about the settlements, judgments, and attorneys' fees, $500 million that we go into the bond market and borrow like it's nothing. There's no sense of urgency around the way in which we are wasting taxpayer dollars. There's a lot of efficiencies that we can wring out of the current system. But the reality is we are going to have a conversation about revenue. There's no two ways about it. Unless we get relief from the General Assembly to extend the runway and the ramp that we have to fulfill, 2020 is looming large in the city, and we're going to have a serious conversation about revenue.
So waste, fraud, and abuse, what would you cut, Mr. Chico?
Well, I've been through 20 budgets in my career, and I've never had an easy one. The fact that this is $1 billion over 4 years, frankly, is not out of the ordinary. But I think you have to do three things. One, cut waste. Two, raise new revenue, which doesn't put an additional brick on the back.
Is that taxes? Raise revenue is
well,
taxes?
A casino is not taxes. That could be $300 million to the city every year. Legalize marijuana, right? Recreational marijuana, maybe $150 million. Properly assess these downtown high-rise office buildings that are getting away with murder right now, maybe a couple $100 more dollars. 1% tax on $1 million home sales, another $150 million. But don't forget about cutting the waste. I've called for the elimination of the clerk and the treasurer's office and the infrastructure trust. That's
so give me a total on the other stuff. What, do the math on that.
$700 million, and we're just getting going.
Because casinos are peanuts, and marijuana are peanuts. Ms. Enya?
$300 million on a casino is not peanuts.
The casinos aren't going to come online in time.
So I do not support a casino. I don't think that by the time all the actors have gotten their hands into the pot that it would generate the kind of revenue that we need. What the city has to do is identify short-term as well as long-term strategies. In the short term, it is going after public funds that we have given to developments, and we've not clawed back any of those funds, especially when they have not upheld their end of the bargain. We also have $1.7 billion that we will be paying just in police misconduct cases alone because of the lack of implementing police reforms. We also have to consider what is the economy of the future. That is how we assess our property taxes, understanding that the global economy is moving away from...
I got all that, but we're looking for numbers here now. Ms. Lightfoot?
Yeah, the casino, the marijuana tax, the progressive income tax, none of those things are going to come online in enough time to help us deal with the issues in 2020. And realistically, unless we go to the General Assembly and get some relief this year, we're not going to have the revenues that we need to be able to generate the payments that's mandated in 2020. This has got to be a Chicago-Springfield solution, or we're not going to get there. Again, I think we've got to demonstrate to taxpayers that we're treating their precious tax dollars seriously. But those issues, they're not going to come online on time.
But
Can I do numbers?
You may.
In the first year, what we could do is we could do a moratorium on new TIF spending, which could generate $200 million. We could also do a payment in lieu of taxes for nonprofits, which could generate up to $20 million a year. We've done parking ticket amnesties in the past. That's generated $10 to $20 million every time we've done it. If we get our fair share of our sales tax back from the state, that's another $20 million a year.
But
that's
my
how we
math
start.
on that is about $400 million at best,
Well, we need
right?
300 to start. That's where we need to start from. During that first year, we need to do some forensic accounting of where the money has gone. We need to stop borrowing to pay our debt. We need to have budgets that actually mean something, not just numbers that we blow through like nothing. We have to stop vanity projects and political projects and do needs-based projects. We don't need a $95 million police academy, which is going to cost $180 million.
I'm glad you said that. Just have a show of hands. How many of you believe there should not be a police academy, a $95 million police academy?
So that would be... Plan?
Pardon me?
The mayor's current plan?
Yes. So Lori Lightfoot, no. LaShawn Ford, no. Amara Enya, no. Gary Chico, yes.
I would put it in a different location. You said the mayor's plan, right?
The mayor's plan for that academy.
I'm for a police academy because we need to have state-of-the-art training facilities, but I don't agree to put it in a neighborhood where the people don't want it.
The question around the
Vanity
Police
project.
Academy is there's been this imbalance in investment. And so you have a community that's been disinvested for decades, like many on the South and West sides, who have been calling for economic investment, investment in housing, and all of these other things. And so the idea of putting a police training center and marketing it as an economic development project, quite frankly, is unacceptable for communities that need a whole host of other investments, not just in police infrastructure.
Red line, I'm just curious, expansion, I'm looking just for a yes or no on 130th Street. Yes?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
5 yeses on that. Okay. Let's take a shift, shall we, into ethical issues and personal issues. Ms. Enya, you've said that your reported past financial problems, which include failure to pay student loans and rent, failure to report income, a state elections board fine, are hardships that actually resonate with Chicagoans. But if you've been at a loss as to how to juggle those finances, how do you tell the taxpayers that you have the skills to juggle a Chicago budget gap of $252 million in 2020?
Well, certainly in two ways. One is for so many families that are struggling across the city to make ends meet, they're making tough decisions about whether to buy medication or to buy school supplies for their kids. Part of why my story resonates so strongly is because there are so many Chicagoans that do understand what it means to try to make ends meet. We have many people who have student loans and are struggling to pay them off and also to find work in this city. There is a difference between personal hardship and managing a city of this size and
But
scope.
what have you shown the taxpayers about what you can do in terms of management if you couldn't manage that?
By actually addressing those issues. So they were being addressed before the election. Many of those issues had been taken care of, and when they came to light publicly, we actually addressed them head on to the public. We held a press conference. I think that the notion that your personal financial hardship should disqualify you from leadership is quite frankly wrong-headed. We have had many mayors who've had stellar personal finances and have come from wealth and have yet brought the city onto the brink of financial ruin.
One other ethical question. You've cast yourself as a progressive reformer, but you've accepted the endorsement of Dorothy Brown, who has long been under an ethical cloud, and her office is under a federal investigation. Why did you do that?
Well, certainly Clerk Brown and myself talked very frankly about the investigation that she's under. Prior to her endorsement, I support the rule of law. She also supports the rule of law, and that investigation must continue. It's also important to note that she, throughout the campaign, has been a voice for independence and against the machine, which is also a part of my narrative. People are looking for anti-establishment candidates. They do not want the machine, and she also represents that.
Gary McCarthy, you've headed 2 police departments that were forced into consent decrees. Does that point to a problem in your leadership?
No, it points to the fact that a police leader has about 20 minutes to turn around the culture of a department when they take it over. In Newark, they went back 16 years. Here in Chicago, they went back numerous years. So it takes a little time to change a culture. And the facts around that support exactly what I'm talking about, which is, believe it or not, police reform. When you've got lower crime, less arrests, less complaints against officers, you're obviously going in the right direction. And I had that in every department that I've ever run.
Gary Chico, you were on the school board, and at the time that you abstained some 400 times from votes involving your lobbying or your law clients. That's almost as many as Ed Burke. Is that what's meant, therefore, by the Chicago way?
No, of course not. Those 400 abstentions were done out of utter transparency. Some I had nothing to do with. Remember, I was part of 2 international law firms with partners around the world that may have done something that I wasn't even aware of with somebody that came before the board. I thought it was better to be transparent. But let me say this, that was out of 12,000 votes cast. And those 12,000 votes represent a turnaround at the Chicago Public Schools, which Bill Clinton called a model for the nation. So I'm proud of my record there.
You were also endorsed by Alderman Ed Burke. You started your career long ago with his finance committee. Is it time to reject that endorsement now?
I have repudiated it. And remember, I don't think Alderman Burke said anything differently than, for example, Paul Vallis or Bill Daley said when I ran in 2011, that I was the most qualified to be mayor in this city. So, no, I've repudiated that. And look, I stand on my own record. I'm Gary Chico. Everybody can see what I've done over the years in various positions I've been asked to serve.
Well, Sean Ford, you were sentenced to 6 months of probation for misdemeanor federal tax fraud. Should that give voters pause?
It should definitely let voters know that we have a system that is flawed and attacks minorities, blacks. I mean, that situation, as you know, the 6 months probation because I underpaid my federal taxes. And then at the end of the day, the federal government sends me the $3,700 back saying that you did not underpay your taxes. You know, that's a system that we live in, a criminal justice system, and I stand here today letting you know that that's what I'm fighting against as the mayor of the city of Chicago. We're going to stop that in this city.
Stop which?
We're going to stop the fact that people are going to be charged with crimes that they did not commit. We're going to stand against that. I was attacked by the federal government.
But being clear, mayor isn't going to affect the federal government.
No, mayor will affect the many people in the city of Chicago that's under attack with charges of felonies that they should not be charged with. Yes, we can stand against this type of corruption in the police department, and we could be a city that stands against the indictments of people that are innocent. I mean, this was a very trying time in my life, and I beat it because I had resources to do so and family and friends to stand with me. But there are many people in this city right now that don't have the resources to fight back the corruption of our criminal justice system.
Lori Lightfoot, you headed one of the original police accountability agencies, OPS. Mm-hmm. And it had a terrible record of police accountability. You were there 2 years. Do you feel like there was something you should have done that you couldn't do or didn't do?
Well, it didn't have a terrible record when I was there. Look, OPS was started in 1974 when I was 12 years old, and it existed after I was there. But during the 2 years I was there, I'm very proud of the record. For example, I made sure that we enforced what was called the lie you die rule, Rule 14, which meant that as a police officer, if you lied by omission or commission during the course of your duties or an internal investigation, you were subject to discipline up to and including termination. That rule was never enforced when I was there. Now it is. And frankly, I enforced it so vigorously when I left, the FOP tried to raise the standard to make it impossible for the lie you die rule to have meaning and effect, and I insisted that that happen. I made sure that, for example, in police-involved shootings, there was a terrible murder. That's what I would call it, at 95th and Dan Ryan, where an officer shot and killed a man in cold blood. I did everything I could to make sure not only that he was terminated, but also, frankly, I tried to get the federal and government to bring civil rights charges against him when the state's attorney failed to do it.
Was he terminated?
He wasn't terminated because I left, and the next superintendent, frankly, gave him a slap on the wrist. I mean, the challenge is when we were embedded within the police department, so all we could do was make recommendations. I think the system is better now because it's a freestanding organization that has a lot more power and scope, but I'm very proud of what we did to really press police reform and accountability. That's the record I took with me to the police department as the president of the Chicago Police Board, where I turned around accountability. We were at 35% when I started. We were at 73% of holding officers accountable during my tenure as the police board president. And frankly, the only reason it wasn't higher is officers started quitting before they faced the police board in evidentiary hearings.
The story that Alderman Ed Burke allegedly tried to extort a business owner has renewed so much attention on ethics in this city and in our politics. I just want to go up and down, and I'm looking really only for a yes or no on 5 areas. Would you support a ban on outside employment for aldermen? Mr. McCarthy.
It's not really a yes or no. I'm sorry, Carol. I say if it's conflict of interest, absolutely. If you're a tax attorney, you shouldn't do that.
But you wouldn't purely rule it out?
If you own a hot dog stand, okay.
Gary Chico?
I support a full ban on outside income.
Amara Enya?
I actually am in agreement with Gary. I think you can have 1 job, 0 jobs, or 2 jobs. If the institutions of corruption are not addressed, it doesn't matter the outside income. If there's a clear conflict of interest, such as tax attorneys, then certainly.
Okay, LaShawn Ford.
Outright ban.
Outright ban. Yes. Lori Lightfoot.
I agree with Gary. I think the fundamental problem is people trying to monetize their positions and allowing their outside interests to take precedence over the people's business. And frankly, if there is a conflict, they got to put it fully on the record so their colleagues know, and they can't participate in any deliberations on the issue.
Can I say something, Carol?
Quickly.
I'm sorry, but I'm stunned by the fact that there was an office called the Patronage Office in Chicago. And this goes back to where the problem lies. We accept these things. That's okay, even though we know it's wrong.
Next question. Would you give the Inspector General subpoena power? Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, he has some subpoena power.
Broader subpoena
the
power.
problem is he doesn't have audit authority over the committees. Ed Burke has fought him. The city and Rahm
is that a
Emanuel
yes?
allowed it, so that is a yes.
LaShawn
Full,
Ford.
full coverage.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry, Gary. Chief?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and I would also give them arrest powers by putting police officers working there also.
Mr. McCarthy, term limits for a mayor to 2 terms?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Chico?
Yes.
Zenya?
Yes, most major cities have it.
Yes.
Ms. Lightfoot?
Yes, called for it in August.
Okay. Eliminate aldermanic privilege, Ms. Lightfoot.
100% has to go.
Yes.
Ford, yes. Ms. Zenya?
Yes.
Mr. Chico?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy, yes. How many aldermen should there be? I'm just looking for a number here now. How many aldermen does it take, not to sit on the head of a pin, but maybe to run the city of Chicago? Ms. Zenya?
I think it's the 50 aldermen is not the problem.
Just looking for a number.
I think 50 is fine, but we have to eliminate the corruption that's tied to the position.
Okay, so 50 is okay. Mr. Chico?
50 is okay.
Mr. McCarthy?
I don't think we need more than 25.
Mr. Ford?
50.
Ms. Lightfoot?
I'm not interested in consolidating any more power in the aldermen, and I agree that the problem isn't the number. The problem is the corruption that starts with aldermanic prerogative.
So, when we talk about violence in the city of Chicago, we talk about probably our most serious and daunting challenge. The Chicago Police Department consent decree does not address the FOP contract. Can each of you give me one concrete change that you think must be altered in the FOP contract going forward? Mr. Ford.
I would think that we have to deal with the racism that's, and make sure that the police have what you call critical race theory education. We cannot depend on the police to be trained by the very police that have been found to have violations of ethics of them on their own record. So we have to make sure that there's critical race theory education and no longer allow the very officers to train the police officers in the force.
Ms. Lightfoot.
We have to make sure that we do a much better job of holding officers accountable. That means we have to be able to look at the entirety of their CR history, the complaint register history, and that's relevant to look for patterns. The current contract doesn't allow for that, and I think that's one of the biggest mistakes. There's a whole laundry list, but if you're asking for one, that's where I would start.
Mr. McCarthy.
We need a much simpler disciplinary system in CPD. This is a recommendation that I made in 2012 that turned into a big pile of nothing called the SAFER report. The police superintendent is not in charge of the discipline of the CPD, yet he or she is accountable for all their behavior.
Mr. Chico.
I agree with Gary. I would simplify the disciplinary process, but please understand, you cannot allow anything that goes on with the negotiation of the contract with the FOP to trump certain basics that are needed. You know what I'm talking about. Would take precedence over what we need to do to build the trust again between the community and the police department. So I don't care what the collective bargaining negotiation process is. We have to make sure that we're following the consent decree and nothing sought in the FOP negotiating process overtakes the consent decree and what we need to do to rebuild the trust between the police and these communities in the city.
What prohibits that, though? I mean, what stops
Nothing.
that?
Not
I mean,
one thing.
Nothing stops it, but you have to.
Nothing
But you
stops
have
it.
to assert yourself as a mayor with the FOP.
but
to
practically speaking, every mayor has attempted to, quote, assert himself or
But now we
herself with
have-
the FOP.
But now we have.
No, that's not right. That's not
No?
right.
But we
This
have-
Correct me on that.
This mayor has not been. This mayor has stood silent through outrageous conduct by the FOP. For example, calling upon their members not to take overtime during some of the most dangerous weekends in the summer. He would not stand up to the FOP. He's refused to articulate what values he's taking into the negotiations. And frankly, he's given up the negotiations and leaving that with a long stack of to-dos for the next mayor. So I don't agree that Rahm Emanuel has led on this issue. He hasn't, flatly.
So I would say that two specific things that have to be addressed if we're interested in restoring trust or building any kind of trust is one, the state legislation that governs the length of time that we have exposure to the records. There has to be transparency on the records. Many of the community meetings that took place over the last several years said we want to know the records, the disciplinary records of officers so that we can avoid hiring problematic officers in the force to begin with. Another component that is crucial, especially given the acquittal of the 3 officers in the Laquan McDonald case who had conspired to construct the story is that 24-hour time period.
Who were
after
acquitted
the
of
incident. They were
conspiring.
acquitted, precisely. Is that 24-hour time period afterward that for many is a time where they can actually conspire and construct a narrative. These are the things that have to be addressed if we are interested in rebuilding trust. And I agree that the mayor has simply thrown up his hands and he's not negotiating in good faith.
So, Mr. McCarthy, as a former superintendent, are those practical approaches?
They are, but you have to have some brash and difficult conversations. I've publicly said that the FOP needs to really come into the 21st century and realize that policing has changed over the last 3 years, certainly since I've been gone. It's changed dramatically. That has to be recognized, and it has to be a good faith effort on both sides to realize that this is in the best interest of Chicago. But you also have to realize that they need to have rights and protections just like any other American citizen.
So, Mr. Chico?
There's something important here, too. We have a consent decree now that we didn't have before this, okay? I had a consent decree at the Chicago Public Schools regarding special education. That affected what the union was able to ask in terms of their demands during collective bargaining. So we should take advantage of this consent decree and limit some of the things that the FOP would ordinarily ask. Again, to
Do you
me,
see the consent decree as shortcutting the FOP contract
I think it
functionally?
can be. I think if we insist and we scrupulously implement it, it will cut back some of their power.
Ms. Lightfoot?
The consent decree is not a panacea. First of all, it allows things that shouldn't happen. It allows for chokeholds. It allows for shooting into crowds. It doesn't provide a policy for foot chases. It doesn't deal with civilian oversight of the police department. It doesn't deal with the out-of-control amounts of money that we're spending on settlements, judgments, and attorney's fees. There are some good things in the consent decree, but unless we actually look holistically at what is absolutely going to be essential to reform our police department, we're going to be coming up lacking, and we're going to end up like New Orleans or Cleveland and have to do the whole process all over again.
Chokeholds and shooting into crowds
The
are not allowed
key
now.
is to make sure that we recognize that the problems that we're having in the Chicago Police Department impacts the west and south sides of Chicago, black people. And we have to make sure that we deal with the race in the police department. If we don't deal with that, it's going to continue to fester. Race is an issue. And last thing,
hang on.
we cannot just assume that this is going to happen. You know, I don't think that racial understanding is something that we're going to find. As mayor, we're going to create this understanding.
I mean, are you saying that you set up a set of guidelines that
you have to be
imposes
a mayor
racial
that
understanding?
comes out front and say that I do not tolerate racism in my police department. You have to be a mayor that say you have to see this black man and this white man equal. If you
Mr.
don't
McCarthy.
do that, that's a problem.
We have to deal with race in society, first of all. It's not just in policing, it's in everything that happens.
But we're talking about the police.
The people who distrust the police distrust the entire system. And that's something that needs to be acknowledged. The second thing, just really quick, is that chokeholds and shooting into crowds are already banned in the police department. Doesn't have to be addressed in the consent decree.
Ms.
The
Enya?
consent
What
decree
no one
allows
is
it to
talking
happen, though,
about-
Gary.
what
That's
no
the
one is-
problem.
What no one has brought up is the role of community input in this process. So we did have a number of proposals that were put on the table. If we're serious about addressing the issue of trust, then we have to make sure that those inputs are actually considered in the process. It cannot be just within the Fraternal of Police or even just within the mayor's office. We've got to implement the ideas that came forth out of community deliberations. We can't do this process legitimately without that component.
Community deliberations include a discussion of the CPD gang database. I'm just curious, with a show of hands, how many of you support keeping the gang database?
I
Mr.
would
McCarthy?
reform it. It's got to be reformed.
Mr. Chico, partially then? No, Ms. Enya?
I have a bill that we've been fighting to pass to ban it.
All right, Ms. Lightfoot?
No, unfortunately, I think the way that CPD has conducted itself, the current, it's actually multiple databases, they have to be decommissioned.
I know some of you have already answered this question, but I'll ask it of all of you anyway. Would you keep Superintendent Eddie Johnson if elected, Mr. McCarthy?
He can apply for the job this time.
Mr.
I
Chico?
would not, because I think he's failed on several key indicators, not the least of which is our horrible homicide clearance rate relative to New York and Los Angeles. 17% in Chicago versus 80+% in LA and New York. Just right there is enough to make a change.
Ms. Enya?
The responsible thing for any incoming administration is to open up the process again.
Except for those golden parachutes.
Well, without golden parachutes, but you open up the process and have a legitimate search that's actually followed, unlike in the case with our current superintendent.
Mr. Ford.
We need a superintendent that's going to speak firmly against racism in the department and lead this police department in a new direction to save taxpayer money and to make sure that the city is safer for police and for the communities.
So that's no to Eddie Johnson.
I don't think he's cut out for the job at this time.
Look, it would be easy to pander to the crowd and say we should get rid of him. The challenge is we're now in February. The new mayor's not going to take office until May. Between now and then, the police department has to continue in its primary mission to keep people safe. It's got to start implementing the consent decree, and before the new mayor takes office, it's got to start its plan for the summer violence season. So to make Eddie Johnson a lame duck, destabilizing the leadership of the police department before the new mayor even takes office, I think it does a disservice to the community and does a disservice to the line officers. After the summer season, we would certainly sit down and have a conversation with Eddie. Police department has a lot to do to improve their record on a lot of different indicators, not the least of which is the homicide clearance rate and keeping our people safe. But pandering to the crowd and saying off with his head. Pardon me?
You would keep him?
I would keep him through this fall, and then I'd have a conversation. I just think it's irresponsible.
Nobody
to
would fire him
throw
right away.
We can't fire him.
We
We don't
can't
have
fire him right
authority.
No,
away.
that's what you're both saying.
Let's
No,
move
no,
to schools,
no, no.
because Chicago Public Schools is in a crisis of its own in terms of maintaining enrollment, in attracting students. To each of you, Mr. McCarthy, how would you reverse enrollment declines? Just one panacea that you think would actually have traction.
Well, it starts with the analysis of what we expect the population to be over the long term, because we've been losing population, yet our enrollment of kids has gone down at an exceptional rate because there's so many unenrolled kids.
So we need to study it?
We need to first do a study so that we could have a long-term plan and enact it. It's that simple.
Mr. Chico.
When I was president of the Chicago School Board, we had 440,000 students. Today we have 360,000. We lost 80,000 students. Why did we lose all those people? I don't think the programs that we're offering are meeting the needs of our parents. I mean, for example, I've offered up vocational technical education as a major new platform to rebuild CPS. Why? Not everybody's going to a four-year college. Some people want to start working right away. And we should work with the trades and other organizations to maybe repurpose some of our existing high schools for preparing people for work right away. When we do that, it'll appeal more to the parents and they'll want to send their children to us. I think we can rebuild the enrollment in CPS and make it something attractive again that people want to go to.
Ms. Lightfoot, what would you do with enrollment in CPS?
Look, the enrollment is driven by the conditions on the ground in the neighborhoods. We don't have good quality neighborhood schools everywhere, particularly in black and brown communities. And people are leaving the city because it's violent, because they don't have hope, and they don't have jobs. So solving the CPS issue is about making sure that we have, in effect, a Marshall Plan to uplift the quality of life in neighborhoods, and the schools are one of them. I don't favor closing schools. I favor turning them into community schools and re-engaging the parents, the teachers, and the other stakeholders so that we can chart a course and a future together that makes sense for those neighborhoods. But you can't look at the CPS issue and loss of enrollment in isolation. There's a lot of other factors that are rolling up into the fact that we're losing school-age kids.
LaShawn Ford?
You're only losing those school-age kids in communities that's filled with vacant and abandoned properties. You have communities that are vibrant and enrollment is high. So what we have to do is make sure that the city has a plan immediately to fill those vacant and abandoned properties and draw people back into these communities.
With what money?
With what money? The federal government, we have CHA. CHA is there to make sure that we use that money to build in these communities. We have TIF money that could be used for these properties. We also have IDA. As a state rep, I know where the money is with IDA, where we can have low-income housing built in these communities. We have business relationships. You have relationships with the people here. We can develop these communities, and then the communities will grow and people will come back.
Ms. Enya?
There are structural issues with CPS across the board. I think that the analysis that Gary is talking about should have happened years ago in predicting the city's overall population loss. When families leave, their children leave, but we did not plan for that, and so we were constructing new schools even as our population was declining.
Did we invest too much in charter schools?
We created a stratified system that pits charter schools against public schools, and so we have to actually change the student-based budgeting formula as currently practiced in Chicago, because it penalizes schools based upon population loss.
Mr. Chico?
Secondly, we have a selective enrollment model that actually is driving families out of the city because they do not want to have to struggle to get their kids into the few selective enrollment schools and would opt out to the suburbs instead.
Mr. Chico, to charter schools?
I think we'll always have a better school system when we have a menu of options for parents, including charter schools, including selective enrollment schools, including STEM, including performing arts schools. You need all of those. Remember we said earlier, if the parents don't feel that what you're offering is sufficient for their child, they're out of here.
But Carol, they only have charter schools in black and brown communities. Something's wrong with that. And it's clear, it's true. I mean, you see the under-enrollment in the black and brown communities. This is not a situation where it's my perspective. If you study it, you see only charter schools coming up in impoverished communities.
Well, the reality is this issue of equity. Mr. Chico is talking about giving parents options, but we also found that there are some parts of the city that don't have IB programs or any infrastructure. We're finding that there are other parts of the city that have expansive enrichment programs while others do not. So fundamentally, CPS has to have an equity department that looks at capital expenditures as well as programmatic expenditures so that we actually have quality choices.
I'd like to give parents the option of living in a neighborhood that's actually peaceful. Look, the reality is if we do not get a handle on the violence issue, all of these other things that we have aspirations for are not going to matter. People are leaving the city because they do not feel like it's safe, they do not feel like they have opportunity, and nobody wants to put their kids at risk and have fear be the norm for their children.
You know, most people don't know you. Most people don't know you as people. They know you as candidates. They may know your names. I'm just curious, just to shift gears for a moment. Mr. McCarthy, what was your experience in school? What was your favorite subject?
History. I always loved history, and I have this sense that if we're not aware of history, we're doomed to repeat it. And that's what I see happening here in Chicago. The Chicago way has to disappear because it's been the guiding light for this city for decades, and that guiding light has resulted in overwhelming corruption. So if we want to fix the gun violence, the taxes, the economy, the school system, affordable housing, it has to start with ending the Chicago way and the corruption that is killing everything in the city.
Mr. Ford, what was your favorite subject?
History as well. I agree with you, finally. Jesus Christ. So history is my favorite subject. In fact, I became a teacher to teach it in Chicago public schools. And so to me, we learn from the past, and I think that people should recognize that during this election, we have to know that during Black History Month that we're in, we need to make sure that everyone celebrates Black History Month. And when we do that, I think that our society becomes better because Black history is American history.
I was just about to ask Ms. Enya her favorite subject. Ms. Enya.
Well, so I was one of those unique students that almost every subject was my favorite subject. And so my educational pursuits, I went all the way to a PhD. I went to law school, had multiple bachelor's degrees.
So all of the subjects are your favorite. Mr. Chico.
I'm a student of learning.
I had two. Science, I loved biology. I was actually pre-med in college for a while. And English, because I love to write and practice writing.
Ms. Lightfoot.
Well, I was a grade geek, so I loved school. I was also a kid who played trumpet in the band. I sang in the choir and was president of student government all my years in high school. So my parents didn't have a lot financially to give me, but the one thing they emphasized over and over again was the power and importance of education. And I took advantage of every opportunity.
You wouldn't be here if you weren't high achievers. You wouldn't be here enduring this gauntlet of a race unless you have a lot of discipline and skill. But I'm curious, Mr. Chico, where have you failed? Where in school or in life have you just flat out failed?
Oh, probably several times in business, school sometimes. But the lesson to learn, at least that
Give me an example. I just want to hear a story.
Well, sometimes I didn't do too well in chemistry in college. And I had to face the facts that I wasn't studying hard enough. I had to double down, pick myself up, and get a passing grade in that course. So, I mean, look, there's a lot of lessons in my life where I haven't done exactly what I want to done. The key that I've really taken away from those things is pick yourself off the ground, reassess, recommit, and get it done.
Mr. McCarthy, where have you failed?
It's going to be hard to talk about. I pride myself as a leader. I've been in the middle of crisis situations so many times and led people through it. I actually failed to take care of some of my people on 9/11. I didn't recognize what it was doing to them. I didn't recognize the impact it was having on them emotionally. And I failed because I was so busy trying to get through every day and help get that job done that I wasn't sensitive to the needs. That's the worst thing that's ever happened to me.
Ms. Enya, where have you failed?
I think to date, something that sticks with me as a failure, although I do think it's how you respond to it, is I was the editor-in-chief of the Daily Illini many years ago, and soon after I left, we had an incident where a cartoon was published. This is actually a global incident. A cartoon was published that led to someone being murdered, and the current leadership of our newspaper actually was one of maybe 2 publications in the entire country that published that cartoon. And at the time I was on the board, had just left, and I felt that I hadn't provided enough guidance for the sitting editor-in-chief to make a decision that would not jeopardize many of the students that were under our leadership. And it was a very difficult time. It was a very difficult time.
Mr. Ford?
You know, being a believer in a higher power in God, I think that my failures sometimes come up short being the best Christian that I could be.
And is there an example that comes to mind?
You know,
for
just
you?
not being, you know, the perfect person. We all strive to be perfect. We all strive to be God-like. We all strive to make sure that we live as God would want us to live. And sometimes we fall short. I mean, it's nothing criminal. I mean, but it's definitely a personal goal that you have as a Christian to make sure that you try to be the best person, whether it's working out, whether it's being the best son, the best father, being the best friend that you could be, and being the best state rep. You know, being a person that contributes to society, you know, sometimes you fall short.
Ms. Lightfoot, where have you fallen short?
Well, you know, as a fallible human, multiple times every day, right? But I guess what I would say is, when I was younger, I was very much afraid of failure. What I think about is, when I was thinking about college, as a kid who came from a poor working class family, even though I had good grades, I was afraid of applying to like Ivy League schools on the West Coast, for fear of not getting in, but more really for fear of not fitting in. I didn't think I'd be able to carry my weight. I imagined these kids flying off to Europe for spring break, and I just didn't think a kid like me would fit in. And with the benefit of hindsight, I think that was a mistake. I was afraid of pushing myself to reach those heights.
All right, a little lightning round as we round the bend to the end. And this kind of a show of hands, but I'll also call out your name, so WBEZ listeners know which one of you has a hand in the air. Should Chicago pursue a high-speed tunnel to O'Hare? A hand to show yes? Not a single hand?
No, it's a mistake.
No,
it's a total waste of money.
there are other more pressing transit issues, especially transit equity issues that
Okay,
should be
lightning
prioritized.
round.
Yes.
Should Chicago open opioid overdose prevention centers where drug users can be supervised, have a clean setting for needles and that?
Yes.
So that is a no to Mr. McCarthy, yes, Mr. Chico, Ms. Enya. Mr. Ford, no?
Well, I can't answer it like that. There's a way to answer that question.
Right.
Yeah.
It should. So I think it should be integrated with rebuilding the infrastructure around mental
Mental
health,
health
behavioral health
centers.
services.
Is that, would you all agree, mental health centers
Yeah.
would be
Yes.
a component of
and
all of
rehab
that?
at the same time.
Sure.
Okay. We expect Springfield to legalize marijuana shortly. Should people be able to just grow a few pots in their house? Ms. Lightfoot?
No, I don't think that's the way to go. I mean, look, I think we've got to learn the lessons of states like Colorado, which is very different than states like Oregon, and obviously California is coming online. But I think we have to do absolutely everything we can to deal with addiction issues, and that means making sure that we keep marijuana out of the hands of kids. I think it's got to be heavily regulated, and we need to make sure, frankly, that the communities that have been devastated by the war on drugs actually share in any economic largesse that comes from that. But we've got to, having people just grow pot
don't grow it in
willy-nilly.
your home.
No,
Mr.
I
McCarthy?
don't think that's
The
a good
black
idea.
market is going to cause more crime. The issues surrounding crime and legalization is something that people don't realize. Where there's no place to deposit the money, there's a lot of robberies and shootings like California and Colorado. So we got to kill that black market. We can't let that happen.
Mr. Chico, are you going to grow it at home?
No, I will not grow it at home. No, you should not be able to grow it at home. It should be properly regulated so it doesn't fall into the hands of children. But I'm more interested, as interested in Chicago getting its fair share of the tax revenue. If we don't do that, what's the point?
Ms. Enya?
We have to address the entry into that sector, not just as a consumer, but also from a business perspective, especially for those communities that have been marginalized.
So no.
It does have to be regulated. We saw in Colorado, they saw an increase in car accidents.
Okay,
and
I'll
they're
take that as
linking
a
it
no.
to-
Mr. Ford?
I would just answer that as no without a long explanation. But I would expect to talk more later.
All right, this is a very serious question. Ketchup on a hot dog, yes, Mr. McCarthy, or no?
Never.
Mr. Chico?
Never.
Ms.
Not in this
Enya?
city.
Never.
Yes.
Whoa, the man stands out. And Lori Lightfoot?
Where's the exit?
I mean, it's a vegetable.
Oh, come on. No, never, never, never. It's an
Lori
abomination.
Lightfoot.
No, never, never, never.
All right, and this is for the younger members of our audience. Do you drink Malort?
Only under duress. That is the worst tasting alcohol ever.
Ms. Enya?
Once, but you cannot be a Chicagoan if you have not tried it.
No, I don't drink it.
No?
I've never tried it, but apparently I have to. So I'll try it and then say no.
You know, I'm not supposed to weigh in on this, but I think it's disgusting. Okay.
Absolutely.
And this is the last really two questions. And please be quick because, Danny, how much time do we have? We have exactly 3 minutes, so this is really fast. Mr. Ford, what sets you apart as a candidate from these other four?
Oh, clearly, I'm experienced and able to fight the corruption and the politics that we see in Chicago. And out of all the people that's on this stage today, I'm the only one with no connections to any of the past, Rahm Emanuel or Daley.
Ms. Enya?
Two ways. One, I have the broadest horizontal policy experience, and I also have the broadest vertical experience, having worked at the top level of government, but also as a grassroots organizer and everything in between. We need that well-rounded perspective and leadership.
Ms. Lightfoot, what sets you apart?
Well, I think a number of different things. Number one, I'm a former federal prosecutor. I'm the only one in the race who's actually tried, convicted, and sent to jail a corrupt city alderman. Long before all these other folks were talking about good government, I released a policy back in August that called for term limits, not monetizing. But I think the other thing is this. Poll after poll shows that people in the city want change. I am the true change agent. I'm the only independent candidate in this race and is willing to take on the tough challenges because of my experience.
Mr. Chico, what sets you apart?
I think it's the breadth and depth of my experience in overseeing 5 governments, all of which are pretty relevant to the job of being mayor. I'm ready to step up to this job on day one.
Mr. McCarthy?
35 years of public service, 17 years at the upper end of city government, 3 major cities in this country. I learned business management, applying it to government, and I'm not involved in the machine. Suddenly it's fashionable to not be from here.
We have exactly 1 minute, and I'm asking for a name. If not you, to make it to the runoff, who here or in the field?
Amara.
Mr. Chico?
I really have to think about that. It's a very serious question. I like to think about it.
So you abstain. Ms.
Yes.
Enya?
No one who came in after Rahm decided that he wasn't running
Well, there were
again.
those who didn't. So who else? Nobody? You're abstaining?
For now. That's
Mr.
the biggest criteria for
Mr.
me.
Ford?
Well, you know, I think that I could work with any of these people and help them lead the
Who
way
do you
to
most
a better
trust?
city. I like Amara.
Okay. Ms. Lightfoot?
Nobody who came in after, and frankly, what I'm focused on is making sure that I'm one of the top 2 a week from tonight. That's what our plan is.
So Lori Lightfoot, LaShawn Ford, Amara Enya, Gary Chico, Gary McCarthy, thank you all for being with us. And our thanks again to the City Club of Chicago for helping underwrite tonight's forum. Thanks also to our audience here tonight on WTTW, on WTTW.com, on Facebook, on YouTube, plus those listening at WBEZ 91.5. And to the candidates again, let's give them a round of applause. We're back to wrap things up in just a moment.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the City Club of Chicago.
Smart people may disagree about what makes a great city, but part of what makes Chicago great is that we don't have to agree. To run a city like ours, a lot of issues come up. The City Club of Chicago is a place to debate those issues and hear from the men and women who shape the policies, lead the industries, and tell the stories that define our city. For the free and open exchange of ideas, the City Club of Chicago.
That is our broadcast for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing and join us tomorrow night live at 7. Governor J.B. Pritzker will deliver his first budget address. We'll have reaction and analysis to that. And after nearly half a century in business, a Chicago shop tries to hang in there. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Carol Marine. Thank you for watching and good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, an accredited legal education provider and proud sponsor of the continuing legal education program for lawyers held at DePaul University College of Law on February 21st.